became an earl's bastard. Chapter 1. The story begins with a description of an expensively decorated room that was lit with a few candles. Someone called out to the young gentleman, asking if he had been in the bathroom. The red-haired man looked around and replied that he would be out shortly. He pulled on a robe. He was greeted by a gray-haired character who smiled at the guy, handing the water to him. Ron was a former assassin who had arrived on a ship from the eastern continent. The young master thought that his interlocutor pretended to be kind, but was actually a sneaky and conniving type. The protagonist should have started by introducing this creepy old man to Choi Han. That's what the redhead thought, but he only said thank you out loud. The first person he met in already such a situation. There were many strong people at every turn in this world, which was why he needed strength to defend himself. If one planned to live a long and quiet life on a continent where war was about to break out, one had to be at least somewhat strong. The protagonist sat down in a chair and thought that if he overdid it, he would immediately start attracting attention. Suddenly another servant entered the room. The man wanted to help the young master get dressed, but the man wanted to choose something simple. As he expected, due to his appearance and physique, everything fit the character perfectly. And it is true what they say, the final touch in style is the face. Next, the young gentleman stepped out into the hall, where several maids were waiting for him in a bow. Each wished good morning, until the lad heard one of them say it with difficulty. He wondered if it had been that bad. Although Cal never hit people, when he got drunk he would wreck everything around him. All he did was drink and do whatever he wanted. A real monster. Well, the protagonist was better off. No one would touch him. They opened the door in front of him and wished him a good meal. Now Ron could eat, too. The character went inside. There were 4 people sitting at the table, a girl and a boy on the right, a woman on the left, and a man at the head. Kale's family. The father, Darith, was the current head of Henedis County. Stepmother, Valen, is a countess. Younger brother, Basin, and sister, Lily. The protagonist was again accused of being late and was asked to sit at the table. The head of the family didn't stand out in terms of strength or power. It was just that he had an impressive fortune. And the stepmother and her children tried to avoid contact with the guy. It was the perfect conditions for a comfortable life. When he finally sat down, 4 pairs of eyes followed him incessantly. The character inquired if those wanted to say something. He heard a negative reply. Even though everyone was used to it, he was still uncomfortable with it. So the man decided to eat quickly and leave. This was the first time he had ever had the opportunity to consume such meat. The younger brother fell into a stupor when the main character smiled. Next, the character saw the wine and brought it to his lips as he continued to eat. Cal was called out, who sharply mumbled that it was delicious. His father waved his head furiously in agreement, though he couldn't believe he had heard it. However, he was pleased to see the boy like that. In the protagonist's opinion, being considered a bastard was really the best. No one accused him of lacking manners, and it wasn't worth pestering Basin. It was better to live idly, in a safe place, being the feudal lord's older brother, than to survive the strain of traveling from these lands to nowhere. But if getting closer didn't work out, one could follow that scenario, go somewhere where there wouldn't be war. The head of the family wondered if Kale needed anything. He hesitated, and after a few seconds he said that he wanted money. The man promised to give as much as he could, and he did. This family didn't just have a lot of money. In that case, he should have changed his plan. The protagonist called Ron over and asked what day it was. March 29, 781 according to Felice's calendar. Kale realized that he had to hurry. Soon Choi Han would be coming here to Weston. Chapter 2. The carriage was moving down a clean city street. The protagonist stepped out of it with a disgruntled look. He approached a building with a sign that read Scent of Poetry Tea. Kale gave an order to the character behind him to leave. He, in turn, inquired if the young gentleman needed to wait. It was not required, for the lad would be there a long time. Inside was a man with glasses, and when Cal stepped inside, he immediately noticed the persona next to the table. It seemed to be the owner. The same man greeted the protagonist. The rich illegitimate child was Bilos, who looked like a piggy banker to Kale. The fellow placed the coins on the table and mumbled that he would be on the 3rd floor all day. He ordered any tea but sour tea to be served, and asked if they had any novels besides poetry collections. Fortunately, they did. The protagonist asked to bring the most interesting one. The host exclaimed that even for a whole day, 1,000,000 jelens was too much. Kale had a lot of money, so he could hand out tips. He wanted to try the crazy spending of money. The protagonist silently pondered as someone was on his way to report the incident to the feudal lord's residence. But the early morning suffering of the main entrance chased him away. At that moment, on Choi Han's mind was first the normal funeral of the villagers, and only then information about those he had killed in a state of passion. The little guy was very loyal. Even if dozens of such bugs died, it didn't affect their lands in any way. He remembered shouting at the top of his voice that the one glass of alcohol he drank was worth more than the lives of these insects combined. Choi Han had replied to him then that it was an interesting thought. He was extremely curious if Kale would change his mind. The guy abruptly approached and grabbed his chin. The main character was nervous now, he even had goosebumps running down his back. The content of the book was no longer important. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, the man saw something outside the window. Choi Han was standing in front of the guards. He was being asked for his papers. Except he couldn't have any, Kale thought. At that moment he retreated, but the character could wait until nightfall, and then immediately jump over the wall and sneak in. And that's when Choi Han would encounter a drunken Kale. The man stood up and mumbled that he would go out for a while, but he would return later so no one should take his place. Calmly opening the door to the outside, he stepped out like a ghost. The guests watched this with alienation. The guy didn't break anything and just walked out. Of course he heard them. Not that Kale couldn't fight back against strong men. Even though a war was going to break out on this continent soon, he shouldn't be too strong. But if no one was going to get sick and die early, one should have been strong enough even for that. Because otherwise something was bound to happen that would make it hurt. An ancient power, more specifically the power of an incorporeal shield, like a magical shield. The protagonist looked at the street pastries and pondered the fact that today he would lay the foundation for obtaining this unbreakable protection. Chapter 3. The character was startled to recognize the young gentleman and greeted him. However, Cal wasn't even surprised by such a thing. He decided to take the bread, tossed in a coin and indicated what quantity. Another one to pack. The manipulator prodded the baker, saying that if the man wasn't satisfied with something, the man could go to someone else. The character shuddered, but exclaimed that he would do it all right away. The purchases came out to a huge sack, which Cal threw over his shoulder. The surroundings were unfamiliar to him. Some kind of true fantasy world. Apparently whoever he was thinking of was regularly rampaging around here. There was so much attention. The protagonist had stepped on something, and now he needed to get to the bottom of the matter soon. Several hiding silhouettes appeared behind him. The man climbed up a small hill and dropped his sack, wiping his sweaty forehead. Noticing how high he had climbed, he noticed how heavy the bread was, and the door in front of him was so ancient. He unlocked it and stepped out to a tree that was at least several hundred years old. Suddenly someone shouted for Cal to stay away because it was eating people. A cannibalistic tree. Rumor had it that those who hung from it dried up at night. And that's exactly what the protagonist needed. Once upon a time there lived a man who was in the service of God, but he was so obsessed with food that he was banished for the sin of gluttony. And when the character died, a tree grew in the place where his body had been. It absorbed that man's resentments and strength, the power of the unbreakable shield that Kale wanted. While the children warned him of the danger, the boy raged, for there were such curious kids in all worlds. They had to be escorted out first. The man stood up, causing those to shiver. The twosome guiltily mumbled that this tree could eat Kale, so he tossed them 2 rolls and asked them to leave. While one grabbed the gifts, the other beggar continued to stand his ground. The protagonist asked if those knew the bastard Kale. The girl gave an affirmative answer while her brother asked her to leave. She embarrassingly stammered that the man was not allowed to die. Now the guy decided to start again. He took out some bread and put it in the hole under the roots from where the object had disappeared. It seemed to the character that it would suck his arm along with it. The shield is a remnant of that man's power, died of starvation. Traditional stuff like that he could trust quite well. The protagonist had read that the tree was to be fed until the darkness was gone. It was considered the embodiment of resentment. It was also written that when the darkness was dispelled, a light would appear, and if Kale saw it, the indestructible shield would be his. The boy spilled out of the sack all the bread he had so the tree would eat more. Chapter 4. The man watched the dark hole and thought that should have been enough for about 10 more bags like that. The aura had become eerie, apparently so strong was that man's resentment. He was going to come again tomorrow. The children in the meantime were gorging themselves on bread. Kale knew they were scared anyway, so they wouldn't go near the tree. But it wouldn't be very pleasant if the children stuck their heads in the hole and ended up being eaten. For them, of course, not for him. The man explained that if the twosome wanted to eat bread tomorrow too, they should have kept quiet about it. The host asked the protagonist if he had left. The boy said he hoped to see him again and added about the delicious tea. The book was interesting, though Kale hadn't gotten more than halfway through it. He liked the growing character getting recognized for his skills. The boy asked him not to let others read it, because when he came again, he would finish it. The man consented to set it aside for him. Moreover, he would wait for him again. Cal walked away. Some time later, at the inn, some stranger bowed fearfully before the young gentleman. It was natural. Where the protagonist drank, everything around him was subsequently thundering. He tossed a coin to the man, ordering a bottle of the usual, and a roasted chicken breast without salt. The character asked if Cal would like to sit down, but the man continued to stand silently, so the man exclaimed that he would do so immediately. There was silence inside the establishment. All the brigands and slackers here tried not to look at the protagonist, which, by the way, was atypical. The usual noble bastards drove with criminals and mercenaries. Cal despised such people. They were paralytics to him. The man was served what he'd ordered. Since it was Cal's usual drink, it was probably a bottle of the most expensive liquor. Next, the guy opened it and tasted it, making his insides burn. Along the wall, about 100 paces away from the entrance, there was something. Yes, just as he suspected. Here, the moment Choi Han jumped over the wall, he spotted a kitten carefully licking the fur of another kitten. This world was full of such coincidences. Chapter 5. Next, the protagonist thought about the fact that the guy behind him had acted right in following him. He didn't like cats, though these ones were cute. The red little guy rubbed himself affectionately against Cal's leg and purred. At this moment, Choi Han was watching the man expectantly, so pretending he hadn't noticed them wouldn't work. The boy made a bold assumption, deciding that the brunette liked him a lot, but he had to go. Cal petted the kittens and made it clear that they would still have a meeting. Sure, he had to pretend he didn't understand his actions, but Choi Han was probably carefully analyzing whether or not it was easy to kill him. The protagonist asked why the man didn't move until someone recognized him as the young master. Cal would prefer that no one stammered when addressing him, because it was a bit unpleasant to hear it every time. They went inside. Ron greeted the protagonist with a slight bow, so the boy wondered if the man had really been waiting for him here. The creepy old man met Choi Han's gaze. Cal could see some sparks in space now. He willy-nilly indicated for the man to follow him. The butler asked what the matter was and offered to escort the man himself. However, the guy gave a negative answer. He didn't need them to stare at each other. Suddenly, someone called out to my lord, noting that he had even returned home. As it turned out, he had been assigned to Cal. It was the deputy butler, Hans. It was in him that the man wanted to launch a bottle, but he managed to dodge and move away. The character became red as a tomato and agreed to take it away. The protagonist, on the other hand, threatened to throw the bottle next time. Hars cautiously asked where the young master was going. In the second kitchen today, Choi Han had another person to meet, the son of Ron's mercenary, Bikros, another creepy person. He was busy cooking with that look and those hands, as if he was ready to kill. Choi Han had to meet him, for the reason that when the man had witnessed his strength while beating Cal, full of admiration, he had followed the protagonist. The red-headed man decided that if he could fuse Choi Han now, Ron would also go with them. Out loud, the man asked to give his guest some food. Bikros raised his knife and looked questioningly at the speaker when he asked him to put the cold weapon away. The boy repeated his request again, citing Choi Han's hunger. The deputy exhaled and gave an affirmative answer. The protagonist had succeeded. All three of them were now tied up. Cal also asked for the best of everything to be cooked for him as well, of course. The steak prepared yesterday by Bitrix tasted incredibly delicious, so the man called him a great cook. The character himself didn't realize what was going on. The young gentleman continued praising him. Since the steak was so good, his dinner would be excellent too, so Cal would be looking forward to it. Hans called out to the young master and wondered what to do about Choi Han, who stood silently to the side waiting for something. He is Cal's guest, so he should have been addressed accordingly. As he planned, the trio met, so that was the end of important matters for today. If that doesn't work, the protagonist will do something to get Choi Han beat up someone else and make Bikros see it. The protagonist asked Hans not to be annoying and just bring the food to his bedroom when it was ready. The man did not respond, instead going to Darith with a report, mentioning that Cal had visited a tea house run by Flynn's illegitimate son, bringing home a young man whose identity could not be ascertained. The latter, in turn, replied that, unlike how it usually happened, he drank within reason. The head of the family was not even willing to put someone on him. Either way, as long as it was in Darith lands, whatever Cal did was in his jurisdiction. The man ordered Hans to continue his surveillance and make reports on everything. The boy bowed and gave an affirmative answer. The head of the family, on the other hand, remained silent and pondered on something. He noticed that Cal had changed. Chapter 6. Darith noted that the protagonist was not behaving as he usually did. Of course, he hadn't suddenly become smart or strong, but his behavior had changed. The Count called Hans over and asked him to get information about Flynn's illegitimate son. The boy bowed and agreed to the task. As it turned out, it wasn't just Cal who had changed. The atmosphere on the continent was also turbulent. Hennedus County lived quietly, building up wealth little by little. The man remembered how he taught his children not to make history, but to just live for happiness and peace. The Count turned around abruptly and stated aloud that he needed to strengthen the city walls. The protagonist felt discomfort, his stomach didn't feel good, and the sight of that old man Ron from the morning, who brought lemonade instead of water, made him even more nauseous. The character snidely remarked how Kale was sleeping very soundly, so he didn't bother to wake him up. The guy was silent for a while, until he finally asked the butler if he had hurt himself, because the bandage was somehow irritating him. It was a mere trifle. The little kitten had let his claws out and scratched. The brute was clearly just another innocent human. Kale handed the mug over. He was leaving to take care of the rest outside. Ron asked if the young gentleman liked the lemonade, to which the man gave an affirmative answer. The protagonist decided that he was in a bad mood. Suddenly Choi Han appeared in front of him, his abrupt appearance startling the man so much that he quickly slammed the door shut. The butler scoffed at Kale and emphasized that yesterday's guest was waiting for him outside the door. The character had closed it too swiftly that he hadn't even had time to say a word. Ron asked him to wait in the room allotted to him, but he replied that he wanted to meet the protagonist. Except that Kale thought it was an outrage, because he could have just said so, but he obviously deliberately didn't. The guy asked what Choi Han wanted, because the man just stood there. The man replied that he needed food. He even offered to work it off. The protagonist said that it wasn't required. The thought crossed his mind that he looked like a crazy person who was using the guy as labor. Choi Han actually had a request. Kale thought that it probably had to do with Harris Village, so he mumbled aloud that he didn't need to ask him specifically, and instead went to Hans. He was considered a capable deputy butler who could handle any ordinary requests, and Ron was capable as well, so he would definitely listen to him. The protagonist asked the butler to do his best to help the guest. Choi Han stared at them silently for a while until he noticed that they didn't know him at all. Except that Kale didn't think he should have. He'd helped a man who was having a worse time than he was, and he didn't need a reason to do it. He didn't think the guy would ask for something impossible. But if the request turned out to be just that, Hans would rightly refuse. Now he had to go, business to attend to. Today the protagonist planned to build money in many places, so now he was on Erevansk to pick up his pocket money. Ron promised to fulfill the young master's errand. However, he did not care. Fighting was the concern of the protagonist and his companions. It was somewhat curious, this fearless puppy, as the butler called him, hated sour food. Still clearly couldn't stand it, but he drank it anyway. Ron figured he was scared, which meant he knew something. His thought process was stopped by Choi Han, asking him to take him away. The young man who stank of human blood pretended to be innocent. Even for a fractured personality, he was broken too much. Ron stretched a caustic smile from ear to ear and gave an affirmative answer. He turned around and his guest looked around suspiciously, casting a quick glance at Kale, who was moving in the opposite direction. Chapter 7. The protagonist once again found himself at the ogre tree, which was surrounded by a pleasant aura. On his right shoulder, the man carried a sack full of food. He also dumped it into the dark pit by the roots, just like last time. More. It was asking for more. It seemed creepy to the boy. The same young girl's voice that Kale had read about. That's right, it specified that a priestess serving the god died of starvation. Only the young lord didn't know why, but Darith had told him to stop by his office tonight, so even if he was late, he needed to get out of here before dark. It still wasn't enough, however. Now the guy would have to run around more than he had bargained for. Tonight, the protagonist planned to throw half of what he needed. The kids were also sitting chewing bread and watching him. He had already emptied yesterday's bakery, and it would take a long time to prepare that much bread, so he needed to find another place. My lord was accosted by someone. The stranger mouthed cheerfully that she had plenty of baked goods. Kale knew her to be a good merchant, so he asked his aunt to bring everything she had, and quickly. He tossed a coin into her hands, making her glow. A large sack appeared in front of the hero. She was indeed a fine saleswoman. The woman offered to cook more, which made him like her even more. Suddenly their dialogue was interrupted by another character who said that they could do the same and even better. The young gentleman added that next time he would shop at his bakery, so he would have to make a bag at once. And now Kale was going to pick up the bread tomorrow at 3 places at the same time. Things were going smoothly, which really lifted his spirits. Someone in the shadows was watching the protagonist, who was already carrying one sack on his shoulder. He was interested in what he was doing. It was Beatrix. The man assumed the guy had lost his mind. When Ron, his father, called him busy, the character himself was indifferent. But the longer he had to watch, the more the desire to agree grew. Cal was as interesting to watch as the black-haired boy. In the children's hands was a small flask of herbs. The boys were nervous, for this was neither bread nor cake. The protagonist didn't care and asked them to leave, but the boy jumped out, blocking his path and shouting that he shouldn't have died. Kale, no, Kim Rock-soo, was a regular mediocre orphan, so there was a lot of sense in the character's greed and sympathy, except whether such unfortunate children really needed such sympathy. Once such words sounded like a mockery to him, but when the man grew up, he fully realized their meaning. It irritated him. It disgusted him that little children felt pain. Of course, it didn't make him want to hold them to his chest. But still, the protagonist said out loud that he wasn't going to die. The ogre tree was begging for more food, though Kale was relentless in filling it with bread. It seemed to him that the color had lightened a bit, so she was bound to repay that waste. The protagonist noted to himself that the kids had left. It was immediately easier as the wounded children disappeared from the horizon, until suddenly he noticed the 2 kittens from yesterday who apparently remembered him. Except he didn't need this extra hassle. Inside the huge building, someone asked for a repeat. Dorith explained to Kale that he would be going to see the royal family as a representative of their house, which made her understand why the reception would be held now. At first the head had planned to send Basin, but the protagonist was the firstborn. This time, the royal palace was holding a big event, and the children of all the noble families were invited. Although not to the royal palace, all such events since the year before last had been attended by Basin, so this time it would be better for him to go. The main character got serious, a case of terrorism. In a place where a large number of residents of the capital, a secret group organized a terrorist attack, and the one who prevented them from carrying out their plan halfway, skis Choi Han. He saved many citizens who were in the square, and so found himself connected to the royal family and the crown prince in particular, becoming his friend. Again Kale got goosebumps, for he was going to be sent there. It was said that Basin usually attended such events, so maybe that was why he should have been sent to this one as well. The protagonist didn't want to go to such a dangerous place, but he couldn't ask his younger brother to go. No one would send a bastard like him to the capital, after all, so Dorith's decision seemed strange. Kale would have to send the future in 5 days. That's when the protagonist could get tutted by Choi Han, so he would recover in the county. Hence, in the initial story, there's no way Kale could have gone there. As it turned out, he was the one who had attended such events before Basin. He just had to remember that time and depart quietly. The man replied to his father that his request was unexpected, which made him confused. The boy didn't understand why he had to go, so he asked for time to think. Dorith let his sons go. Cal was the first to jump out. Basin called out to him and added that his brother had every right to go there, except that the protagonist had been forced out of his place as heir of the family. Since the year before last, his youngest had been functioning as heir opposite. And now he was also saying that Kale could act as the representative of the clan, which was becoming a bad situation. But another problem was that it was for the sake of the future that the man was worth the risk. The protagonist would not be in mortal danger, and there could be new opportunities there. Besides, he would not want Basin to die without becoming a feudal lord. He had to live for a quiet and peaceful life. Suddenly, someone came upon the young lord and started talking about today's guest request. It was Hans. Kale asked to call for him. Judging from the expression on his face, Choi Han's case was somewhat well resolved, and the protagonist had an event at the royal palace that wasn't in the plans. The man also added that if the man refused to come, he should have said something about the debt. Since Kale had to go there, he would arrange things as comfortably as possible for him. Choi Han had a chance to work off the food. He was going to make it his trump card. Chapter 8. The protagonist thought about how Ron had fed his guest well every meal. Even his face brightened. The butler and Burkas and Choi Han had really found a language. Unexpectedly, the boy asked how he could work off the food. Kale noticed that the man got straight to the point. He had already changed the course of the first part of the hero's birth a bit, expecting not to interfere in any other way. But since the guy was going to the capital, it might involve more changes. First, the man needed to make sure he could handle it. Simply put, it was a job interview. Choi Han waited for a question from the interviewer. According to the first one, Kale wanted to know if the guy knew how to protect people. He was changing the plan in a hurry, but it seemed to be even better this way. The protagonist was going to make sure that Choi Han's patty didn't get hold of the ancient powers, and he himself wished to get his hands on them. They would still have plenty of them anyway. The man was trying to make sure the man wasn't killing, but saving people. The guest was silent for a while, until he took a deep exhalation and gave a coherent answer. The guy clenched his hands hard from nerves, and Kale realized he was still unstable. Now he wondered if Choi Han would dare to kill someone. The answer was yes. That meant he could defend as well. Of course, it was difficult, but not impossible. When the main character was Kim Rock-soo, he couldn't just say, "It's difficult," and go the other way. So the character is extremely content that he could now live in the bastard Kale's body. However, there was a brutal mountain of obstacles in the way of his peaceful future, which meant he needed someone to carry him over that mountain on his hump. Choi Han agreed with his interlocutor's position and smiled. According to the last question, Kale wished to hear the guest's real name, who in turn was surprised that the man didn't know, except he was already aware of it, the guy who was supposed to beat him up. He'd been called names by others, but the roundup hero wanted Choi Han to introduce himself. He mouthed his name and held out his hand. Kale Henidas cheered up and added that the job as payment for the food was easy. Rosalina and Lack, the survivor of an assassination attempt by the princess of a neighboring kingdom, Rosaline, and the heir to the Wolf King, Lack. The last survivor of a powerful family looked ordinary and frail, but he was tougher and more aggressive than anyone else when he was enraged. Rosaline, on the other hand, possessed the strongest destructive power after Choi Han's power. However, she had no desire to take the throne. Her dream was to create the best magic tower on the continent, and gradually she managed to become a real heroine, and all those who attempted to kill Rosalind were later tortured by Burkos. Lately, Kale's heart was getting worse. He teasingly said that the guy was right when he saw the names of the two people, but first he had to go with the protagonist who had laid out a map on the table. From there, Choi Han should have traveled to the specified location. Kale just had to walk to the halfway point with him. In one of the Birth of the Hero chapters of the first volume, one Marquis was replacing the protagonist as the antagonist. He crossed paths with the Crown Prince and Choi Han time and time again. That bastard raised a crazy dragon. He thought he had successfully tamed a wild beast that wasn't even 5 years old. But the creature managed to escape, after which it finally broke down and went insane. Choi Haru managed to defeat him, and he gave the dragon freedom and death. But Kale will have to go through the very village that the dragon will attack. If it is tried to bypass it, the man will be very late to the capital, so it was necessary to deal with this mythical creature before it went mad, or let Choi Han finish him off. The protagonist instructed the guest to go to the capital accompanied by these men. That was the task at hand. If you wish to protect them, so be it. But the most important thing was to get to the capital in one piece and then meet Kale. When the man was curious if he could protect himself, Choi Han lowered his head and began to remain silent. He confidently said yes. The protagonist thought he should have had something to drink for courage before the conversation, so he released him, asking him to keep everything a secret. The character put on a satisfied smile and replied that he understood. Late at night, Cal asked his father for money. The man mumbled for the boy to ask the treasurer, giving it to him. Money was the best thing in the world, according to the protagonist. Suddenly, he was called by Ronnie and offered to drink the tea with honey and lemon that his son was giving him. The man said goodnight and added that he would always be there for him. This old man had chased away all of Cal's sleep. Now he was definitely going to fuse him to Choi Han as soon as possible. Chapter 9. Since the morning, the protagonist had been watching a horror movie as if it were a bone-chilling experience. The butler asked if this was the first time the young gentleman had traveled to the capital. He was going to hunt rabbits for him on the way, because he was good at it. Ron said with a smile on his face that since Straight could escape at any time, he had to be carefully watched and killed at the right moment, and then gutted. He had succeeded in that as well. What a creepy old man he was. However, Kale was glad that Ron and Bickrose were coming with them. The stranger was glad of my lord's early return, and he noticed how after a few encounters, the guy was reacting a little more calmly to him. The sack was already ready, and as it turned out, today was the last time. Of course, the baker wanted to get some easy money. Therefore, the protagonist made a promise to come again if he wanted to eat. Seeing the children, Kale decided that they were homeless because they met him at any hour. That was probably why he decided to feed them again, leaving in silence. Fortunately, it was foggy, no one would see what the man was doing here or what he would get. Dumping the bread into the pit, Kale heard a hungry voice asking for more. Abruptly, a bright light glow appeared. Slowly, but the darkness was still changing, which meant that the boy's labors had not been in vain. Except that the tree began to scream, demanding new food. The protagonist had never read such a thing in a book. The voice promised to give a gift if Kale brought more. All that was left was to wait. The last sack was empty. It was definitely going to be enough for the pit to lighten up. Bright highlights began to shine through the roots, even the breeze, gaining strength, played with Kale's hair. The wood tasted so delicate, and the third bag was especially good. Apparently, cooking had progressed over time as well. The main character watched questioningly. The voice continued, "In any case, the bread in the third bag was very tasty. In his time, there wasn't even such a word. It was immediately clear from the taste that the wheat for the bread was also grown on good soil. After all, it also came in many forms." At this rate, Kale was already afraid of not getting the strength. Now the girl was fed up, and the protagonist had an opinion that her anger was accumulated from hunger and because she could not speak. In ancient times there was nothing so delicious. God-worshipping people of the Forest of Darkness always brought her some nasty stuff, and she liked to eat good food. That's why she ran away. Kale needed the ancient power, so he would have to listen to the story. The girl and her friends left in hopes of making the world a better place. She wouldn't be able to give up delicious food even if she became a fat cow. It was so unfair to die gnawing on the ground. As the man realized that the tale of antiquity was over, so he mumbled that it was a fine review of the taste of the food. The voice was glad Kale understood her. Something about it didn't sound like dialogue. The sparse color of the foliage attracted the protagonist, and something warm beckoned his hand. A pillar of light rose from the pit. This was it. The girl would protect him. Light energy oozed through the protagonist's body. A warm power of purest beauty. Everything was ready. For the shield, the wearer's life was the highest priority, and the source of its energy and the main object of protection was the heart. That power would not disappear until the organ stopped. Kale could feel the magic enveloping the heart, and thanks to this dense protection it beat stronger. This was how ancient powers, depending on the specifics, left their mark. Now the protagonist could use the ancient power as it was written in the birth of a hero. An indestructible shield appeared in front of him. Chapter 10. At least twice, if even Choi Han went at Kale with his sword art, he would be able to defend himself. The unbreakable shield, unlike its name, although it would shatter, it would not disappear. If a certain attack power was greater than its limit, the shield would break, but it would return to its heart. Gradually, thanks to its energy, its power was restored. The heartbeat was the source of its energy. If it becomes stronger, the shield will be stronger. This time, on the way to the capital, the protagonist would have a chance to strengthen the shield. And then, even if someone like Choi Han's level tried to kill him, he would be able to withstand not even 10 minutes, but 5 minutes. It was a pleasant feeling. However, Kale didn't like that the shield seemed somehow sacred. Of course, he'd have other people to fight with, so it should have been fine. To the rainy weather, the man looked at the 2 kittens that were playing cutely with his legs. He decided to take them with him. Kale held the animals out to Hans and ordered him to hold them. The latter, in turn, was so excited because they were adorable and small that he even wanted to take them. The protagonist also explained that if he had to make them quiet, all that was required was to feed them. It was a brother and sister making those 2 nervous. The barely perceptible smell of medicinal herbs and distinct baking. Thinking back to all the times Kale had met them, there was only one conclusion. Did they think he wouldn't understand? The kitten with the ashy fur was the big sister, and the little brother was the ginger. Except they'll discuss it later. Hans recalled that the protagonist had said that he would be accompanied by Choi Han, who was guarding him, until halfway to the capital. As soon as Ron heard that, they went to buy things for the trip, and Birox from the kitchen went with them. Kale figured they were getting along well, and it even looked like they were all excited about accompanying the man. The protagonist found himself in the tavern. He noticed that there were no visitors at all because of the rain. As promised, the character returned. The host asked if it was required to prepare tea and a book. The answer was yes. Kale even asked for 3 mugs. The rain intensified, from which the mood only worsened. For the first half of the book, according to the man's musings, Bill didn't have an important role to play. But pretty soon he would have to be sworn to loyalty to Choi Han and show his true ambition. Exactly manifest. Though he couldn't reveal himself to his father or his brother. The boy had been somewhat greedy from the start. Kale found him tiresome, though he couldn't say he hated him for it. It was a trait that made him more human. The tavern owner mused aloud on his knowledge regarding the young lord's trip. As it turned out, he intended to go there as well, and would even follow him. Bilos was to travel to the capital soon to contact Choi Han. The man commented on how much Kale had changed, which didn't justify his nickname of bastard at all. And it's true, he used to be like that once upon a time. So the protagonist wanted to break the chair for confirmation. Except Bilos couldn't call his father father and his older brother brother. Was this really how he planned? To be just a bastard child? Was the tavern owner really satisfied with his current situation? The answer was no. Cal had been acting bastardized for about 10 years now, starting when he was about 8 years old. After such a time, it was quite possible to abandon one's habitual lifestyle, for one could not stay that way forever. Bilos slammed his fist on the table, because he was the same way. except that there was excitement in his eyes. He was sick of it, too. Chapter 11. The protagonist was convinced of the correctness of his words, and with a wave of his hand he beckoned to those who entered. The tavern owner bade them farewell and hoped to see them in the capital. Only Kale didn't want to meet EARL'S because he needed to contact Choi Han there. The men exchanged a few glances and parted ways. According to the contents of the book, Choi Han and EARL'S had run into each other once in passing before the capital. And that's exactly what happened now. The character guessed that Ron was coming too. According to Hans, Bickrose was also with them. Apparently, he had returned to the kitchen, from which he could be called in charge. The young gentleman was asked if he was close to the tavern master. The answer was no, but the butler suspected something anyway. Was nosy to the point of curiosity. Kale even got nervous when it was Ron who asked about it. Choi Han decided that the rumors really weren't worth believing. EARL'S brought tea and wondered whether to serve it to the gentleman. He had ordered a warm lemon drink in advance. He had chosen a special one for Ron. He brought it every morning, so the protagonist decided it was his favorite. This lemonade promoted sleep. Tea with honey and lemon the butler's son brewed especially for Kale. Ron calmly took a sip and put the cup down, causing Choi Han to frown. After that fight, Bickrose had challenged him to a fight, to which the guy, who was soaked in the smell of blood, had answered him. The man replied that now he too would be a protector, for he too was capable of it. An unexpected answer, but during his pursuit he had heard something more unexpected. You can't stay a bastard forever. The situation was getting more interesting. Choi Han and Ron had a relationship of comrades who trusted each other even though they constantly exchanged barbs. In Birth of a Hero, these two were bound by a pact, but they still had each other's backs. The situation had changed a bit, but the basic character bond was unchanged. Sure, it was unfortunate that change couldn't be avoided altogether, but Kale cared about his hide. He didn't want to meet the fate the book had in store for him. Aloud, the man remarked how sweet the tea was, which made it the best. The tavern owner saw his guests getting ready to leave, so he was going to see them next time in the capital. But the protagonist would be stopping by the place daily for a while. But not just for the book. EARL'S would be waiting for them at any time, and the doors of this tea house would always be open to them. Ron noticed that even dislike could awaken affection. Choi Han didn't want the man to be so attached to him. However, this was not about him. The bastard remained a bastard, a puppy who had comforted his father after his mother's death, who had come home drunk and unconscious, but who had never raised a hand to anyone. The butler had been watching him for too long. Ron pondered the idea of telling Bickrose to cook their young master his favorite dish during the journey. The trembling would end and the two kittens would happily greet the master who had forgotten about them. It became known that Choi Han loved small animals. It was obvious even in their first meeting. Just now, this guy wanted to go to his room. He needed to strengthen his spirit so he could protect Kale. The protagonist didn't understand what the guy wanted to accomplish by becoming even stronger. Hans called my lord to watch the kittens become even cuter and more adorable. They were so lively that he didn't even have time to pet them. In Kale's opinion, the guy had sunk even lower than these animals, though they really had been looking a lot better lately. The boy had to run, but he still wanted to do something for the gentleman kittens, like brush their claws or comb their hair. Ron volunteered to help with the rest, and the protagonist went to wash up. Butler realized that these children were from the Mayo tribe, which was a very lucky coincidence for him. The silver color was fog and scarlet was poison. The descendants of this group were very savvy and perceptive, which meant that with proper training, they could be useful. He had to leave the young master some sort of parting gift. Chapter 12. The kittens were literally chasing Cal. They were playing with him. As it turned out, he was already thinking about them. Out loud, the hero mumbled that he wished they would repay him for the food. And apparently the kittens didn't mind. The hungry girl said she wanted meat and her brother wanted cake. The character was willing to give them lots of food, but they would be good for him. 4 days later, the story described Cal's family getting together for a meal. Today, the man was leaving. However, it didn't seem like he was worried. According to the main character's thoughts, in the original story, he was supposed to be beaten to a pulp by Choi Han yesterday while it was raining. But luckily, no one touched him. Besides, now that he had a shield, Kale felt that protection all the time. Even if someone like Ron or Bickrose decided to do something to him, for once he would definitely be able to escape the threat. The man asked his father again to reduce the number of attendants as he did the opposite. It was the stepmother's directive. She didn't want anyone to think they didn't have enough people just because Cal didn't want to bring as many as possible. The woman mumbled that it wasn't that there was anything wrong with the protagonist. She knew people, especially aristocrats, who cared more about how they looked from the outside than anything else. The man had heard that Valen, as the eldest daughter of a penniless baron, had dreamed of the heights. At that time, many aristocrats were actively engaged in buying and selling luxury goods, and the girl, coming to the lands of Henidus, became interested in the art of sculpture. Then she met Count Darith and fell in love with him. Currently, the heroine was the most influential person in the cultural business of these lands. She was extremely opinionated, and another thing she was proud of was the clan she had managed to become a part of. Valen mumbled that many felt it was premature to judge everything by its cover alone. It was no surprise to Kale that she insisted on an increased number of attendants. Of course, the man himself might have been even better off for it. After all, he was no longer comfortable even changing clothes without a servant. However, they might soon meet a maddened, enraged dragon, who knew how many people could get hurt if he wasn't stopped in time. Kale didn't care about the others, but he didn't want to watch a bunch of people die. Nor did he want to be responsible for those who would suffer because of it. Ever since he was a child, he had only been responsible for his own life, so he knew that the worst and heaviest burden was being responsible for the lives of others. The man mumbled that art was considered to hold the soul, and she knew that expression, sculpture, was not created to please other people's eyes. It was created to put their soul into it. The protagonist read that on the memorial. Appearance was not the most important thing either, so read the inscription on the memorial for every aspiring sculptor of their lands. Those words Valen had engraved personally. She wanted Kale to do as she wished with her attendants. But, in return, the carriage and everything else must be of the highest caliber, because that was the only way it was in their lineage, and no other way. The protagonist agreed and asked to prepare all the most expensive things. For example, to find such a carriage so that no delicate part of the body would get hurt on the bumpy road. Dorit asked his son if he had gone through the papers of the heirs of each family. He had, and it was entertaining for him. Among them were narrow-minded people, intelligent and intimidating, stupid, and incredibly greedy for power and money. So many different types. His father would make sure he really read everything. In any case, Cal was free to do as he saw fit. However, a strange rumor had reached the head of the family. They said that the ogre tree had changed. It had become lighter, its leaves had turned green, and where absolutely nothing had grown before, grass had appeared, which was quite curious. Feudal Darith couldn't help but be aware of the fact that the main character went to the slums, though he certainly couldn't be aware of everything, especially the ancient power. The man simply concluded that Kale had something to do with the tree's metamorphosis. The young lord agreed, even if it was a mere trifle. However, no matter what the lad did, rumors were his worst enemy. People's eyes and mouths are the most dangerous weapons. However, as long as something was happening in their lands, such things were not to be feared, and he took note of that. Only here could he have a quiet and peaceful life. Kale wanted to get back from the capital as soon as possible and start enjoying his continued idle existence here. The Earl had more business to attend to, so he wouldn't be able to see his son off, so they would say goodbye at that place. The protagonist noticed his brother's barbed gaze, so he asked what was the matter, and he just bowed. Instead, his sister wished him a safe journey. He also wished her to take care of herself, which made the girl embarrassed. The man approached the carriage, and something made him angry. Chapter 13. Kale tried to figure out what it was. In the carriage sat the two kittens and Hans. Their seat came out better than the man himself. The lad thought the pets should have ridden in comfort, for they were small and delicate children. Except that if Hans had known that they could create fog and emit poison, he obviously wouldn't have behaved like this. Ron made it clear that he would sit with the coachman. Suddenly, someone called out to the young master. It was Choi Han. He asked if he needed to ride in the same carriage for safety reasons, which made Kale think he was getting carried away. And when the man agreed, the situation started to look odd. Until now, the guy's gaze was definitely full of rage and desire for revenge, but he no longer looked broken and doomed. Choi Han's state now was more like one in which he held anger in his heart, but outwardly calmed down. This was how it had been in the beginning, during his wandering with Bickrose, Rosalind, and Lack. The stranger made it clear to Choi Han that he didn't belong there. The protagonist didn't consider him a master. At this rate, he would realize his delusion very quickly. The character asked if it was okay to go already, and Kale defiantly closed the door in his face. In such beautiful weather, the protagonist wanted to order Hans to take care of those presents. He asked his brother and sister if they had brought them something from the capital. Of course, the girl wanted a gift, a sword. Lately, she had been dreaming of mastering the art of weaponry. Everyone in this family had long arms and legs and not badly balanced bodies. She was only 7, but she was already noticeably taller than her peers. With the proper dedication, the girl could well become a gifted swordswoman. Kale agreed to buy her a more expensive sword, and Basson wished for a fountain pen. Abruptly the carriage stopped, making everyone nervous. The stranger exclaimed that if those wanted to pass this mountain, they had to pay, to give up everything they had. As befitted a fantasy adventure, there was nowhere to go without mountain bandits. Kale questioned, trying to make sure the bandits didn't see the crest of his house. Apparently they had. Ron suggested that they rest a bit and go on, because there were a lot of rabbits. But they were different from the ones he was going to catch for him. Of course, these animals wouldn't be caught by him. The robbers were far from being the scariest guys there. The protagonist gave about half a day. After another quarter of a day, they were going to reach the village with the black dragon. The main dish of that evening was rabbit meat soup. It wasn't even Ron who went hunting. It was Choi Han, except why did he bring a rabbit? At this time, the kittens asked him to give it to them if their master didn't want it. That's when Hans showed up, luring them with beef and health food without any salt or seasoning. The young master's escorts had to face dozens of mountain brigands today, and the most capable among the guards was, of course, Choi Han. Another character informed my lord that it was all over. It was as easy as snapping his fingers. You bet, he's a man after all. He could even finish off the Earl's son. There's no man who could ignore him forever. Ron noticed that the main man ate very little, assuming he had no appetite. Kale himself, on the other hand, decided that he enjoyed scaring him. Choi Han thought he had a stomach ache, but the man would have eaten the whole thing if the man hadn't brought the rabbit. Chapter 14. The protagonist asked why Choi Han was following him so closely. As it turned out, the man concluded that this was his first fight, so he asked. Kale clarified if it was about today's encounter with the mountain bandits. It was true, because the young gentleman had never seen so many outlaws before. It was the first time he had ever had to be in a life-threatening situation. Only Kale didn't see it that way. He had killed so many nerve cells because of Choi Han, and not because of him alone. The old man who laughed at the sight of the rabbit he caught, and the guy who sharpened his knife next to him. In such an environment, the protagonist is terrified every second. And now he's lost his appetite again. Choi Han made his point, the first time will always be hard. Kale didn't practice martial arts because he didn't think he needed to. Didn't learn self-defense because he had guards, and they weren't everyone's. The man trusted his heart, so he certainly wouldn't die. After all, it was well protected. Though of course, he would still be better off avoiding monsters like Choi Han. The protagonist never finished his meal, even though he was skinny. The kittens appeared, and his companion decided to do his training right after eating, as Kale pointed out. He needed to get even stronger. However, in that case, in the young lord's opinion, he could blow the entire planet apart one day. The character thought he was creepy. Someone brought up a dish and asked the protagonist to eat well. He thanked the guy, and suddenly a butler appeared. The man mumbled that when there was no appetite, it would be best to drink something sour like lemonade. One of the knights shouted for everyone to quickly finish eating and go straight to their evening training. Apparently, Choi Han had heavily motivated the vice captain. On the third day of the journey, the protagonist pondered over the fact that the dragon was going to have a mana explosion in 3 days. These lands were considered to be the property of a viscounty near Hennidas County. At the foot of the mountains, to the right of the village, stood a country house belonging to him. In a cave under the mountain outside this villa, a black dragon was imprisoned. Though it was called the property of the viscountcy, the viscount himself was just a mutt of the Marquis of Wall. Binion was the second son of the Marquis of the House of Wall, who had taken over the family by making his own older brother an invalid. That lunatic sometimes visited this house. If only he didn't torture the dragon as entertainment, something so dangerous wouldn't have happened. Hans made the remark that the lord was tired, so he and Choi Han would find an inn right away. The boy answered in the affirmative, and he said he'd do it in a jiffy. Kale called out to his friend and asked him to come back quickly. He glowed with happiness. Such a violent reaction even embarrassed the protagonist. It was uncomfortable, as if he was taking a poisoned apple from someone's sweaty hands. Everything was calm until Choi Han tore towards an old man who was crossing the road right at the time of the trip. The young gentleman thought it was such a cliché. The man grabbed him and carried him to the curb in a flash. The protagonist got out of the carriage, deciding to get out in person because there would no longer be the right moment to talk. There he was, a typical overbearing aristocrat. Binion Sten. Chapter 15. The blonde man proudly climbed out of his carriage, meeting Cal's gaze. He was a typical villain from the birth of a hero. The tall lady objected. How dare they block the way of high-ranking individuals? Choi Han shouted demandingly that the person almost got hurt. He blamed them for not knowing how to operate their carriage, which caused so many problems. The heroine believed that commoners should have given way to noblemen's carriages. She named the culprit as an inconsiderate old man. Bandit then ordered the carriage to stop. Hans noticed how angry Choi Han was, so Kale asked him to calm down. Except the man kept echoing that they could have just detoured around the commoner, but they didn't. You couldn't just turn a blind eye to that. Kale looked at the aristocrat's sleeve, noticing the blood that had gotten on it as he watched the dragon being tortured. Bandit said hello and asked if the strangers were from Henedis County. He obviously knew the protagonist. The blonde had only heard tales of a somewhat promiscuous young man in the county behaving inappropriately for an aristocrat. He asked if young Basin Henedis had been attending events in his stead since the year before last. The young gentleman admitted that it was about him. He was the worst and most celebrated among the bastards. Bandit thought him an interesting individual. He'd been unintentionally delayed by the interference, but now he thought it wasn't so bad since he'd managed to meet Kale, whom he'd finally been able to greet in person. Except that his servant had made him uncomfortable, so he should have been given a lesson on how to properly identify those people who had the right to rush wherever they wanted and those who could be detained. The commoner abruptly fell to the ground and began to apologize. Depending on whose territory they lived in, the position of the peasants differed markedly. The Viscount of these lands, being the Marquis of Walsmut, had adopted his character, so he was definitely just as arrogant and overbearing. The protagonist hoped that young Marquis Bennion had finished his speech. Whether the aristocrat would be beaten up by Choi Han or not, as long as he was in his company, he couldn't be allowed to beat up people of high status in public. The man approached the old man and asked where the bar was located. He repeated again, where they sold bearable booze, because he couldn't get a proper night's sleep without having a drink for the night before. In any case, the protagonist was glad to meet the young Marquis of Bennion. The dialogue was interrupted by the girl, emphasizing that they were already too late. The aristocrat ordered her to stay out of the conversation. He explained that he had urgent business to attend to, so he would have to bow out. The man barely shook his hand. Kale mused aloud that if they met in the capital, they should have a drink. Judging from their acquaintance, Bennion was an incredible man. He remarked that only he was worthy of being the head of the Marquisate of Sten and Strait. The guy himself replied that the protagonist was a very nice and simple man, whom they would definitely meet again, which was unlikely because even if somewhere Kale would notice him, he would try to stay away from him. Half of the aristocrats were like that. The protagonist saw that the old man wasn't getting up, so he made the assumption that he had hurt his leg. Choi Han had saved him, so it was up to him to take him home, though he was going to escort the gentleman to the bar first. Only the man had no desire for a drink right now. The mood wasn't right at all. As it turned out, the old man owned the bar. He ran the only inn in this village, and there was a tavern there as well. Since he was the only one, there was no better place to be. Kale ordered Hans to find out the route and then show him. Choi Han asked if the protagonist was angry. He started listing questioningly at what exactly, the prank, being looked down upon, or calling that old man a nuisance even though he almost killed him. The boy thought that Choi Han was waiting for him to intercede. The young master might have said something that his buddy used to say. Once upon a time, he had even wanted to do that, but it was different now. This pattern of behavior was the whole point of life he had come to know. Carefully seeking compromise with authority, calmly accepting other people's irrationality, and dressed up in the midst of it all to live the life he wanted to live. But if someone bullied or stressed him out, he simply had to return that favor. Cal assumed the bastard would soon be kicked out of his kind. Chapter 16. The protagonist wasn't sure about this, but a satisfied smile played on his face. He was going to steal Bullion's dragon. The young lord had been given the best room, where he was going to sleep. The old man said it was the first time an aristocrat had stayed with them. The man offered his services if they were needed and wished him a good night's rest. Kale thought he was appropriately frosty, but this excessive hospitality made him uneasy, so he asked the old man to relax. The protagonist didn't like his servility. His inn couldn't be bad since they were already staying here. The commoner was surprised, wondering if there were many such good people in the lands of Henedis. But the guy thought it was nonsense, since he was considered the worst bastard in their land. Everyone, according to his retort, was much better than him there, and now he let him go to work. The old man made a 90-degree bow. The character didn't seem to know the meaning of the word relax at all. The protagonist invited Hans into his chambers. The man asked if that was all he needed. The answer was in the affirmative. The man handed my lord the box. You could see by his red face how much he was curious. Kale snickered, pointing out that it was customary for the butler to hide his emotions. Except, from Han's words, one of the most important rules of behavior was to keep nothing from his master, which made him look ridiculous. The boy agreed, as if he was proud of it. And then my lord asked him to step out. It became known that they would be in this place for 3 days, so Kale hoped that the butler would take care of everything. Unlike Ron, Hans brought the least amount of hassle. He was surprised by this trip, but he didn't cause any unnecessary problems. A very brave guy. Now the kittens were also interested in what was in the box. The man opened it and mumbled that there was something there that could help the unfortunate creature to leave one boar with a nose, and something that would help the protagonist not to get hurt. The tavern owner asked Kale why he needed the items, though he didn't have to reveal, except that the sum came out a huge amount, so the guy asked to rent. Fortunately for my lord, of course. However, there were 2 items that couldn't be rented to outsiders, so Bilos was going to put them in Cal's name, and they should have met in the capital for the guy to return them in person. He showed the gray beast a dark orb. It was a mana flow disruption machine that cost hundreds of millions of jelens. Topolkov paid 20 million for the guy to rent it. With it, the protagonist could break all the magical surveillance devices on the mountain. However, it had to be installed in advance and wait for some time. And it could work for about 40 minutes. Pretty expensive for a single ball, but what Kale liked most of all was that it was incredibly durable and wouldn't collapse so easily. The boy tossed it to the floor, causing the 2 cats to run to catch it. He wondered if they could read the map. The kids answered affirmatively, referring to the fact that they were heirs of the Miss Mayo tribe. The protagonist showed them which village they were in. There was a mountain nearby. If one walked towards it to the east, one could see a villa. One could not approach it as they might be spotted. Behind it was a cave. The character explained that he wished to free one little boy who was being tortured there. He was even smaller than Hong. The dragon was 4 years old, and now they were going to free him, so the guys should have gone there now in their cat form and stealthily buried that orb somewhere in the mountain. And it didn't matter where, the most important thing was on the mountain. The kittens thought it was an easy task. After all, they had even managed to outrun the older ones from the tribe when they were running away. Kale knew they could easily do it, for otherwise, he wouldn't have given them the task. The man made a promise, once those returned, to give as much beef as they wanted. The mission was begun. Chapter 17. The protagonist was already starting to get used to the taste of lemonade. Choi Han inquired if he needed any help. Only the guy asked if he had ever seen dragons. As it turned out, he had encountered something similar, so Kale made a bold assumption that it was about the monsters of the Forest of Darkness that looked like them. The young master was intrigued by what one looked like. Choi Han replied defiantly that it was a monster, was just as violent, except his mate made it clear that it was nowhere near like a dragon. These mythical creatures were like humans. Dragons, werewolves, dwarves, elves. They all looked like humans, and all of them, of course, were considered intelligent and had feelings. But if such creatures had been in darkness since birth, unable to even recognize themselves, never having seen sunlight, only torchlight, could Choi Han have imagined what it would become? The creature stops hearing the voice of reason. With no family, it has to suffer alone. With no hope of support, it struggled to get through each day, enduring endless torture and abuse. The protagonist anticipated his buddy's reaction, because this kindly man couldn't help but get angry over such a story. Kale then said that there was one such creature nearby. Only Choi Han was even too angry about the story of the tortured dragon. The man asked if the young master was going to capture and train it. The dragon, who had been tortured by humans all his life, would hardly say "fetch me." He was clearly filled with hatred and distrust of humans, so the man thought his interlocutor had lost his mind. The man had heard that dragons, on a subconscious level, considered themselves superior to all creatures, including humans. It was said that they were arrogant from birth, and in fact, even if you raised a dragon, it seemed to Kale for some reason that he would be in trouble. Raising one of the dragons, of which there were no more than 20 left in the eastern and western continent, was like saying, "I will be at the center of the events of all the continents." Therefore, Choi Han wanted to know what the young master was going to do with him. It was so obvious. The dragon should live in the wild, as a wild creature was supposed to. Now the man wondered if they would simply rescue him. The protagonist needed his mate's help, so the latter readily agreed. Only Cal wished to do without killing, and to do everything as quietly as possible. The man ordered him to ask Ron to organize a table with alcohol and snacks on the first floor. The young gentleman was already prepared, and Choi Han was visibly nervous that the man had been drinking so much. There was no problem as long as the man's hands were empty, so everyone was safe. Kale exclaimed how delicious their drink was, which was beyond his expectations. The old man replied, adding that their alcohol was made from herbs and berries that only grew in their lands, so the price was a bit steep as well. However, the protagonist still asked for more. He even asked to pour alcohol for all of his companions. The knight blurted out that it was unnecessary. However, the request was now in order. Kale asked Choi Han to support him to go to bed. Another soldier wanted to help him, but the young lord ordered everyone to rest because there was nothing to threaten them here. The protagonist felt sorry for the guys who were on night guard tonight, but those who were free were supposed to have fun and rest. And now they were definitely going to leave. While the old man didn't care about his plans, he obviously wouldn't like it if something annoying came up, so it was a good idea to let him know ahead of time. Kale had told Ron that he was going to be away today. It was a secret. And when the butler replied that he would be waiting, he added that it wasn't required. The young gentleman explained to Hans and Ron that he was going to sleep, so no one was to wake him up unless it was an emergency. They knew what would happen if they disturbed his sleep, didn't they? The boy wished him a good night's rest, and the man emphasized that he would be nearby. Kale insisted that Choi Han not hold him any longer and asked him to leave, though he whispered in his ear that he'd come in through the window after sunset. Some time later, the two kittens got ready to start. Just then Choi Han appeared. Chapter 18. The young man crept through the window to Mr. Cal's. He, too, should have changed his clothes. As it turned out, these were the clothes of a tact group. The Birth of a Hero had a similar description of her, probably because they kept running into the main character, Choi Han. Kale specifically ordered it based on that description. It was a bit sloppy, but it looked believable from afar. In any case, the only thing people remembered was their symbol, the star pattern. It made the man think they were going to do something bad. Of course, because it would be Bandit who would get hurt. The character asked to be given a mask as well. No matter how kind a person is, if they get an object of hate, they are bound to want to teach them a lesson. Especially a 17-year-old boy who had to live alone for a long time and was barely out in the world. He then introduced the children of the Myo tribe, he and Hor and Choi Han, to each other. Now they could move out. The company moved so fast that their shadows blurred against the dark background. The voice-changing device was functioning normally, and the hidden orb was also set up successfully. And judging by the fact that their magical devices were signaling a malfunction, it was working too. And based on how little the protagonist heard that squeak, it was a far cry from the high-end gadgets here. A shout was heard. The stranger demanded to reveal his identity and tell him how he dared to show up. With a slight movement of his hand, he knocked out the knight. The others appeared, who also didn't understand what was happening. This moved out, using his superpower. The natural phenomenon made the soldiers who couldn't see anything nervous. Suddenly, one of them spotted Kale's silhouette. He ordered Choi Han to cover him. The knights moved into action to thwart them. Only they didn't know their enemy. He easily managed to deal with two in a second. It seemed to them that they had met a master of the sword. The character was furiously raring to find out what they were looking for here. The protagonist's buddy was angry. He ordered them to shut up. And the young master was counting on his abilities. Choi Han threatened, saying that no one would go in there. At that time, someone noticed that the crystal ball wasn't working until he saw someone, whom he ordered not to approach because he didn't know what was in that room. He was frightened. Bandit said in the book that in preparation for the invaders, he had booby-trapped the torture room. If it exploded, the protagonist would explode with it. Poison was sprayed into space. The man fell, allowing Cal to grab the keys. They did a nice coordinated job. It was dark inside, and a large beast, chained together, slept, lurking. They had found the dragon. Chapter 19. The beast lay motionless while the young lord smelled blood. He moved closer and tried to call to it, asking it to come out. The creature opened its blue eyes, which pleased Kale. The kittens noticed it was time to leave. Bandit wiggled his fingers. The main character appeared, carrying a black dragon in his arms. When he put it down, the children feared it was in pain, and the beast was starting to get wound up. Anyway, the man planned to use the healing potion, but first he had to get rid of the mana control ball around his neck. Only then could the potion work properly. The guy aggressively pushed the recumbent's body because it was in the way. Somewhere around here there had to be a secret passage for the blonde man to escape. It was written that Bandit was very afraid of an attack from outside, so he made an escape tunnel. A secret passage unknown even to the servants. There had to be a particularly smooth part of the wall compared to the rest, and the exit was just beyond it. Kale found it, hit it hard enough to get out. Choi Han would suddenly appear, so the chief asked how it went. He had succeeded. Abruptly, the man's eyes fell on the black dragon. As the young lord had instructed, he let the servants escape and knocked out the armed men. Now my lord asked his mate to strike his fist not with all his might right at that spot, as he might have destroyed the cave, as if he wanted to break a wall 10 centimeters thick. I mean lightly. A completely impossible blow for Cal. But for him it was easy. The man struck and broke the surface, and the protagonist lifted the dragon again. They advanced to the exit. The mythical creature looked up at the dark blue sky, looking back at the young lord with interest. He asked him not to look at it angrily because he was helping. The dragon was unruly, and after all, Banian had tortured it brutally for 4 years. Personally, he liked the creature. Kim Rock-soo, who grew up as an orphan in a cruel world, just gave up. He was different from that main character. The man called out to the dragon and grabbed the metal object he was going to use to remove the collar. The baby covered his eyes and in a second was free. Chapter 20. The dragon looked up incomprehensibly into the face of its liberator, who was interested in the reaction. The collar was still energized, so he should have put on his gloves and taken it away. The mythical creature kept glancing around at the strangers. Kale pulled out a vial of red liquid, but the one resisted, even though the man had spent a lot of money on it. He took him by the head, lifting him up, which reminded the beast of torture. The protagonist then gave it a drink of medicine, wishing it a speedy recovery. A blue aura appeared around the dragon, causing its wounds and scars to heal. The young lord wondered what the creature wanted to do now. It was a dragon after all, the most intelligent and proud creature. The lad knew it could speak human language, so he asked for it to answer. What was it going to do with its freedom? The dragon was going to live. First, the beast would run away because he didn't want to be tamed. Of course, it had every right to be free, so Kale would not take it away. Those words made the creature aggressive. He didn't believe it because people only lied. The protagonist was also good at lying. By so be it, now the dragon could now live the life he wanted. He had become free. The guys turned around and went on their way. That was enough. They had gotten the dragon out safely. They had done Banian a favor, and they had protected the village. And now, thanks to the creature, Choi Han understood the meaning of freedom. Besides, the beasts wouldn't follow them, so everything worked out perfectly. The dragon continued to sit in the same spot, saying how much he hated humans. They were bad. Kitten called out to her sister and noticed that someone was following them. She thought so too. Apparently, they had gotten a little brother. The protagonist laughed and called bullshit. Mythical creatures are free-loving. That instinct would never allow them to bond with a human. And this little guy was tortured, so he hated humans. The kittens were wrong. The protagonist asked them to dig up and bring him a balloon. Today was the first time Choi Han saved someone. He did a good job, too. He had to fight mountain bandits earlier, but it was more of a protect than a save. Even though the plot had changed, he didn't save a village, but a dragon. The man asked for Mr. Kale's attention for a moment. He wanted to know what the man would do if the dragon wished to follow him. But, in his opinion, that couldn't happen. The protagonist thought about what had happened and didn't want to waste time guessing. Now this thought kept him in the dark. While the man slept, the black dragon, surrounded by a green aura, sat next to him on the window, holding a vial of healing potion in his hand. Chapter 21. Kale and Choi Han were having breakfast at the same table, even though only the former was eating. The young master had been out of sorts yesterday, so he hadn't noticed. And since all the excitement was gone, he was now feeling hungover, so also could not sleep because of the feeling that someone was staring at him. The protagonist asked his interlocutor if he was done with everything else. The answer was positive. The man had erased all their tracks on the way here and left others leading west. Based on the knight's words, it was known that they should have reached the city in a few days. Apparently, this was the middle of the road that Kale had mentioned. It turned out to be true. The next destination was the city of Parcel. That was where they were going to split up. Up until now, the characters had had a long ride due to the fact that they constantly had to pass through mountains. But now, all the way to the capital city, the road was good, so they would get there in no time. Choi Han had something he wanted to tell Kale. In fact, he was still on his way back to check on the Viscount's villa. Everyone there was on their ears, and a squad of knights had also left from there. The protagonist made the assumption that they had gone to report what had happened, so there was nothing wrong with that. What annoyed him was that the man constantly paused in his speech. As it turned out, the secret passage of the cave through which they had run out had been undermined. Now the kittens, too, were beginning to take heed. Moreover, not only the exit itself, but the trees, the plants, the ground, everything there was in complete disarray. The dragon had done it. All three of them marveled. Kale, on the other hand, exhaled, because the beast, thankfully, at least the unconscious people there hadn't been interrupted. It was still small, so it was probably afraid and hiding. The little guy blew up the passageway, worried that someone might have followed that trail, and destroyed the surroundings to destroy the magical apparatuses. Dragons were very sensitive to mana, but this one was quite bright even for his 4 years old. Choi Han felt that this creature's mana power was incredible. Therefore, as the young master said that, he had greatly insulted the creature by thinking it was small and underestimating it. Now if that was all, he could remove himself. Kale offered him at least a nap for the road, but the man disagreed, citing Bikro's help. The protagonist made the bold assumption that they got along. Choi Han tensely replied that it would by no means ever occur. They didn't get along at all. The young master hesitantly made it clear that he understood, so he didn't ask any unnecessary questions. It was the first time he had ever seen such a look on his buddy's face. The protagonist asked him that when he went out and saw Hans, he should tell him to prepare a table with alcohol and snacks. And judging from Choi Han's reaction, he didn't know about the hangover. Suddenly, the guy froze on the stairs and stopped descending. The twosome saw one of those nights he knocked out yesterday. The protagonist asked what his buddy was scared of. He thought he had put so much force into the punch that he shouldn't have recovered for about 24 hours, but the man had recovered sooner than he thought. Choi Han had definitely underestimated him. He would hit with more force in the future, which was to be expected from a protagonist who pushes his way to his justice at any cost. The old man turned to the young earl, saying that he had brought the alcohol he had been drinking during the night. The man in turn mumbled that the longer he looked at him, the more he thought about it. He was such a good salesman. Kale complimented him because the character brought the perfect drink for his morning hangover. They had a buffet yesterday. They all wanted to relax after the long journey, resting, drinking. No one left the inn. Suddenly the knight exclaimed that he didn't understand why the Viscount's men would know about this. Yesterday a thief had broken into the villa, several expensive things had gone missing, and the other soldier only wanted to make sure they were spared that fate. Kale thought the dragon thief was also a thief. The man clinked the bottle on the table defiantly, which drew attention. The knight was taken aback, emphasizing that his lord could not have woken up definitively without a drink in the morning. In short, he needed a hangover after last night. He was considered an entertaining gentleman. Was that a compliment? They wished him a safe journey. At least they must have eased his suspicions a little. Now that he'd seen how stupid Kale was, he'd hardly think he could pull off such a theft. No one would consider it normal for a noble scion to drink on his way to the ruling family, after all. Probably, when Banian finds out what happened, he won't even take it into consideration. It will be very difficult to find a connection between him and the embroidered star of the secret group on his clothes. The protagonist asked Ron to serve tea with lemon and honey. It did seem to help with hangovers. Even if someone follows the trail left behind, they won't find anything. Somewhere around this time, the blonde was out of his mind with rage.